The Dilettante's Guide to the Meaning of Life. Or did Don Quixote get it all wrong? Part 1. Madness in La Mancha. At the end of Don Quixote, our beloved hero undergoes a sudden and unsettling deathbed conversion. In the very last chapter of the book, he repents of the madness that had caused him to embark on so many improbable adventures, and swears that, sane again at last, he is renouncing the persona of the swaggering knight. It's unsettling, because up to this point in the story, the reader has been willingly complicit in the hero's delusions. We don't want the finale to be the return of plain, boring old Alonso Quijano, the dull landowner of La Mancha. Instead, we want his swashbuckling alter ego, Don Quixote, mounted on his glorious steed Rocinante, fighting injustice, tilting at windmills, and ever trying to rescue the Princess Dulcinea. It's tempting to think, and indeed many commentators have argued for this very thing, that Cervantes somehow missed the point, that the author of the book Don Quixote didn't really understand the enduring appeal of his creation, the character Don Quixote. That despite the author's intentions to the contrary, the illusion of the heroic knight in shining armor in fact reveals a deeper psychological truth. In assuming the mantle of knight-errant, the character of Quixote is being true to his own self. He has transcended the mundane facts of his own existence, and for the first time given his life meaning. That's why the ending feels a bit like a betrayal. When the hero apparently comes to his senses, he no longer seems to be a hero at all. It's not just a down-to-earth with a bump moment, it's a crushing denial that the character of Quixote was meaningful at all. But this leaves most readers unsatisfied. For us, Quixote represents a what-if fantasy. What if we too could throw off the shackles of the ordinary? What if we too were brave enough, in the words of the song, to dream the impossible dream? We love Quixote not despite of his madness, but precisely because his madness allows him to live the dream. The tale of Don Quixote's deathbed repentance, I think, holds a lesson for anyone pondering deep questions of meaning. Was Cervantes right or wrong to have his hero recant? Is it more important to be happy than to face the truth? And what does being happy have to do with living a meaningful life anyway? Part 2. Meaning and positive psychology. The burgeoning positive psychology movement has frequently promoted the importance of meaning as part of a well-balanced or flourishing life. It is the M in Martin Seligman's PERMA model of well-being. More of that later. While Paul Wong, who specializes in this very area, argues that eudaimonic motivation, by which he means doing things that promotes one's own well-being, tends to be more strongly related to a sense of meaning and purpose in life. It would seem then that contemporary trends in psychology would support Quixote's delusion. By becoming the daring knight of his imagination, he has found a higher purpose. His actions have meaning and hence contribute positively to his subjective well-being, which is just a posh way of saying it makes him happy. So Quixote was right to be quixotic. There are a number of objections to this interpretation. The philosopher Robert Nozick's famous thought experiment of the experience machine raises one of them. Nozick asks us to imagine that someone has invented a device that can produce in our brains constant feelings of bliss and joy. If you plugged in, you would be able to experience a perfect life of untroubled delight forever, all artificially manufactured by the machine. The question is, would you plug in? Nozick's perpetual pleasure device forces us to confront the difference between fantasy, however wonderful, and cold hard reality. It turns out that most people seem to prefer actual experience, however unsatisfactory, to the illusion of perfection. So according to Nozick, Quixote was wrong to retreat into his fantasy world. A related objection to many positive psychology models of well-being is that they fail to make value judgments about what counts as worthwhile in the first place. Take Seligman's previously mentioned PERMA model. The acronym, by the way, stands for positive emotions, engagement, relationships, meaning, and accomplishments. It seems like a pretty commonsensical formula for well-being, until someone points out that a suicide bomber in the act of murdering civilians could well tick every category. The suicide bomber definitely has meaning in what little is left of their life. The very act of suicide bombing is giving them all the meaning and purpose they will ever need. Seligman's formula seems to describe the conditions required to achieve a state of well-being, but it does not prescribe how one should or ought to behave in order to get there. In other words, it lacks a moral compass. The difficulty positive psychology has is that any mention of morality or what one ought to do immediately takes us into the realm of ethics and therefore philosophy, not psychology. And supposedly positive psychology is a science in which such philosophical conundrums have no place. But they get smuggled in nonetheless. For example, the online Values in Action survey defines the character strength of spirituality as, quote, having coherent beliefs about the higher purpose and meaning of the universe. But it never bothers to ask whether having such beliefs correspond to any sort of external reality. Or is it just assumed to be okay, like Don Quixote, to inhabit a fantasy world in which how your beliefs make you feel is more important than whether your beliefs are true or not? The very idea of the universe having a higher purpose, as the VIA survey defines it, is a wide-open philosophical and theological question. It may very well turn out to be as illusory as any of Don Quixote's adventures. It is certainly unsupported by our current state of scientific knowledge. As Carl Sagan noted in his 1991 essay on the meaning of life, quote, "The hard truth seems to be this. We live in a vast and awesome universe in which daily suns are made and worlds destroyed, where humanity clings to an obscure clod of rock. There is no compelling evidence for a cosmic parent who will care for us and save us from ourselves." End quote. There is a clear tension between what physicists tell us and what some positive psychologists are urging us to do. At one point in her book, The How of Happiness, psychologist Sonia Lyubomirsky states that, quote, an essential path to finding meaning in your life is almost by definition to work on developing your faith. Part of her reason for saying this is that faith groups generally self-report higher levels of happiness. But does this therefore entail we all ought to rush out and join a cult on the grounds that the more fervently you believe, the happier you will be? By definition, people of faith are predisposed to belief. They accept arguments from authority. This book tells me to behave in this way, so I will. That holy man demands I do this, so I'll do it. Non-believers, who by definition have rejected such arguments, are likely to be more skeptical, more critical, less likely to believe everything has a purpose. And as a consequence, non-believers may be more intellectually restless, unfulfilled, searching, in a word, unhappier. The lesson of Nozick's experience machine is that this is not necessarily a bad thing. Part 3. Meaning and science. The challenge Don Quixote sets us is how to resolve the tension between scientifically derived empirical facts about the world, facts which tell us nothing at all about any apparent higher purpose, and our psychological need to find meaning in our lives. Can science itself provide us with meaning? As a self-confessed dilettante, I'm certainly no scientist. That said, I want to know stuff. I want to understand this great big universe. It's important to me, but does it make me happy? Does it provide meaning? My favorite ancient Greek philosopher Epicurus certainly thought it should. He said, quote, "It is impossible for anyone to dispel his fear over the most important matters if he does not know what is the nature of the universe. Therefore, it is impossible to obtain unmitigated pleasure without natural science. Knowledge dispels fear. Only when armed with knowledge of the natural world will we be free from anxiety. That's the Epicurean point. But these days no one is worrying about whether thunderclaps signal the wrath of the gods. How does scientific knowledge help promote well-being and, crucially, provide meaning in our lives? One answer is that an activity like astronomy can be a transcendent experience, quite literally one that transcends terra firma. Drawing on scientific discoveries and using scientific instruments, in this case a telescope, allows us to situate ourselves within the boundless enormity of the cosmos. It is both humbling and awe-inspiring and helps to put our own concerns into perspective. This is a meaningful sense of transcendence, of taking part in something grander and greater, without any need to invoke ideas of spirituality or religion. But engaging in such meaningful activities is all very well. It doesn't quite capture the popular sense of a capital M meaning of life. Perhaps there is a fundamental problem with the idea of searching for meaning in some other thing, be it a religion or science anyway. Perhaps it is the same as the problem of happiness. The harder you look for it, the further away it gets. In his book Man's Search for Meaning, Viktor Frankl noted that, quote, happiness cannot be pursued, it must ensue, by which he meant happiness happens when you are not looking for it, when you are instead engaged in some other meaningful activity. And Frankl also realized that meaning itself does not necessarily arise from things that make you happy. It is just as possible for someone to, quote, turn personal tragedy into a triumph, find meaning in suffering. Meaning is available in spite of, nay, even through, suffering. Frankl was an Auschwitz survivor. He knew a thing or two about suffering. Part 4. The absurdity of meaning. If it turns out that, like happiness, the more we look for meaning in our lives, the more it seems to slip from our grasp, should we instead abandon the very idea of a search for meaning? Jean-Paul Sartre certainly thought so. He argued that the world is entirely indifferent to our existence and impervious to our attempts to label facts as having any sort of objective meaning at all. Any such labels are nothing but artificial human constructs. There is no higher purpose. There is no object towards which we should direct our faith. There is no meaning to the brute fact of existence. There is no plan. In his view, the whole world is simply absurd. But Sartre wasn't a nihilist who denied that nothing mattered. Quite the contrary. For him, this absurd existence was liberating. The world imposes no expectations on us, forces us to conform to no external values. Instead, we have complete freedom to make our own choices and decide our own fate. For him, this is what it means to live authentically. Does Don Quixote live authentically? Like the protagonist in Sartre's existentialist novel Nausea, is Quixote someone who has realized the absurdity of his own existence and chosen to act accordingly? Cervantes, of course, knew nothing about existentialism, nor modern psychological ideas about the supposed importance of meaning. He was, in the end, I think, more concerned with truth and reality, however unpalatable or unromantic those things may be. The author doesn't want us to forget that Quixote was the creation of a confused old man whose head had been turned by reading too many silly novels. Living authentically, in a Sartrean sense, then, might be more in line with Cervantes' concluding chapter after all. The brute fact of existence must be confronted in all its naked absurdity. The character of the knight-errant, however noble, however honourable and praiseworthy, is a denial of that reality. However much we want to say that Quixote was true to himself, psychologically speaking, the culmination of the hero's journey needs to be an acceptance of the world as it actually is, not how Quixote or anyone else might wish it to be. What then for our own search for meaning? Is the very idea of such a search absurd? One way of looking at Quixote is to see his madness as analogous to entering Nozick's experience machine. Quixote is living a rich, fulfilled life full of meaning and purpose, but at the expense of abandoning reality. However much we might desire a higher meaning or purpose, perhaps we are deluding ourselves, just like Quixote. If so, why not just do what makes us happy after all? For my part, when I'm sitting drinking coffee under the awning of a pleasant cafe in the corner of a beautiful Italian piazza, I wonder if all I really need to do is follow the recommendation of Epicurus, who said, quote, "Happiness and blessedness do not belong to abundance of riches or exalted position or offices or power, but to freedom from pain and gentleness of feeling and a state of mind that sets limits that are in accordance with nature." Thank you for listening. Do check out the blog if you want to read the text. There are a few book recommendations there as well. And check out the blog also for some other dilettantes' guides to other things.